When American lawmakers traveled to Burkina Faso, it was more than a courtesy call, it was a signal. Washington is aware that its influence in the Sahel is diminishing, and this visit underscored how urgent the fight for influence has become. Welcome to the Africa Briefing Room, where we break down the issues shaping the continent. In this briefing, we're unpacking why a U.S. congressional delegation visited Burkina Faso and what this means for a region at a crossroads. The visit, signals and symbolism. On August 29, 2025, a bipartisan team of U.S. lawmakers, led by Representative James Austin Scott, arrived in Burkina Faso for high-level talks. At a time of sharp political divisions in Washington, the presence of both Democrats and Republicans highlighted a bipartisan effort to engage Burkina Faso's leadership. Publicly, the delegation spoke of partnership, security, democracy, but beneath the surface, there were questions about their true intent for visiting the West African nation. Though the team praised Burkina Faso's dramatic progress, reclaiming territory from extremists and boosting agriculture, the country's president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, did not meet with the lawmakers. Although Traoré's absence attracted attention, diplomatic protocol does not require heads of state to receive U.S. congressional delegations. Such meetings are often conducted by senior officials, a practice consistent with international norms. In this case, Dr. Ousmane Bougouma, president of the Transitional Legislative Assembly, hosted the delegation with discussions focused on agriculture, security, and economic cooperation. Some interpreted Traoré's absence as a political signal. However, the overall conduct of the visit remained well within established diplomatic practice. The context, shifting alliances and diplomatic tensions. With France's withdrawal, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger formed the Alliance of Sahel States bloc and deepened their ties with Russia and China. As Moscow and Beijing expand their influence in the Sahel through military cooperation and major infrastructure projects, Washington now faces stiff competition to remain relevant in the region's new geopolitical landscape. The U.S. delegation's visit signals an effort to maintain American engagement amid fast-shifting alliances. Additionally, the visit was also seen as an effort by Washington to repair relations after public accusations by U.S. defense officials. In April 2025, during a U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, General Michael Langley accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré of diverting Burkina Faso's gold reserves to entrench his military government, a statement that provoked strong backlash in Ouagadougou and fueled broader anti-Western sentiment across the Sahel. Security and conflict realities. While the U.S. delegation commended Burkina Faso's efforts in reclaiming territory affected by extremist violence, the United States government suspended nearly $160 million in direct government aid after the 2022 military takeover. As required by U.S. federal law, U.S. assistance typically comes with conditions linked to democracy, human rights, or governance reforms. In light of the suspended aid, the Burkinabe government sought new partners such as Russia for military support. Still, critics counter that President Traoré's reliance on force, rather than dialogue with armed groups, risks prolonging the conflict and deepening instability, even as some communities have recently reported returning to previously abandoned towns. According to data from the European Commission and conflict monitoring groups, such as Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, ACLED, and the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, an estimated 7,500 conflict-related deaths were recorded in Burkina Faso in 2024, and about 1,600 so far in 2025. The argument that dialogue with groups like JNIM, an alliance of several jihadist groups in the Sahel and an al-Qaeda affiliate, or Boko Haram, or al-Shabaab could yield stable peace has not been supported by experience. Attempts at local negotiations in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger typically resulted in short-lived ceasefires or improved humanitarian access, but never genuine or lasting stability. Most armed Islamist groups reject the authority of the state, and international research finds that any participation in talks is usually tactical, an opportunity to regroup, resupply, or gain concessions before resuming violence. These figures and outcomes underscore why, in the Sahel and beyond, hardline military strategies, despite controversy, remain the default response when governments face violent extremist threats. Case studies: security campaigns under the microscope. When confronted with persistent threats from terrorists, insurgents, or violent criminal groups, governments around the world have often turned to hardline military or law enforcement measures. From North Africa to Central America, these responses, frequently controversial, highlight a stark reality. Negotiations with hardline groups have rarely produced lasting peace. 4 cases help illustrate this pattern. Algeria, the Black Decade, Civil War. During the 1990s, Algeria's government responded to Islamist insurgency with overwhelming military force, sparking a civil war that left between 100,000 and 200,000 people dead. The government pursued no-negotiation policies with the most hardline groups, while offering conditional amnesties for others, eventually weakening violent groups through attrition and negotiation with less extreme factions. Internationally, Algeria's counter-terror strategy became a reluctant model for neighboring states. The peace that followed came at a tremendous human cost, including years of state and non-state violence, collective punishment, and long-standing social scars. Egypt, war on ISIS in the Sinai. Since 2014, Egypt has waged a fierce campaign against ISIS-linked militants in its North Sinai region. The military used overwhelming force, shutting down towns, flattening neighborhoods near the Gaza border, and arresting thousands in an effort to cut off insurgent supply lines. Over the years, this hardline approach led to fewer terrorist attacks, and Egypt highlights the operation as a national security success. However, human rights organizations argue the campaign's heavy tactics, mass displacement, blocked aid, and allegations of torture have harmed civilians and risk stoking further unrest. Despite these concerns, Egypt receives continued security support from Western and regional partners, who see Cairo as an essential ally in the fight against global terrorism. Somalia, the battle against al-Shabaab. For decades, the Somali federal government, backed by African Union forces and international partners, has launched large-scale offensives to reclaim territory from al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda affiliate. Al-Shabaab's stated goal is to overthrow the government and establish an Islamist state governed by its strict interpretation of Sharia law. While government offensives have reclaimed territory, yet al-Shabaab has remained resilient, exploiting local grievances and porous borders to continue its attacks. International backers continue to provide security and stabilization support, but the cycle of military operations and militant resurgence persists. El Salvador, Bukele's anti-gang offensive. El Salvador, under President Nayib Bukele, declared a state of emergency in March 2022 to detain more than 72,000 people accused of gang affiliation in under 2 years, while suspending constitutional rights and limiting access to due process. Public support for the crackdown remained sky-high in El Salvador and across the region, and Bukele credits the campaign for transforming the country from murder capital to a beacon of security. Nevertheless, human rights groups and the United Nations have sharply criticized widespread abuses, mass detentions, and alleged state violence, warning that the crackdown risks creating new injustices and unresolved humanitarian issues. Internationally, some leaders have applauded Bukele's approach as a bold solution, while others warn it sets a dangerous precedent for rule of law. Across all these case studies, military crackdowns have more often than not produced security gains, but almost always at a high social and humanitarian cost. Despite international criticism, most governments confronting insurgent or criminal violence remain reluctant to negotiate with the most hardline groups, while international partners often prioritize pragmatic security cooperation over consistent human rights pressure. The bigger picture, a new alliance. For many in the Sahel, the U.S. message of "we're still here to support you" feels outpaced by reality. Trust and public enthusiasm have shifted eastwards, as the AES, Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, forges new models of partnership and regional security. The AES has significant support among youth and wider populations across West Africa and increasingly across the continent. Analysts note the AES's appeal is fueled by disenchantment with Western-style democracy and is seen as a bold step toward sovereignty and homegrown solutions for security and development. A recent Afrobarometer survey across 39 African countries found that 53% of adults and 56% of youth, aged 18 to 35, consider it legitimate for armed forces to intervene if elected leaders abuse power. This tolerance for military involvement is especially high in the Sahel, reflecting deeper frustration with business-as-usual politics and a hunger for bold change. In closing, as Washington seeks to maintain its influence in the Sahel through high-profile diplomatic engagement, some in the region question whether these visits signal genuine partnership or a continuation of old patterns, where outside powers dictate terms and priorities in the name of security and development. Was the U.S. visit really just about Burkina Faso, or was it about the whole Sahel and the race between world powers for influence in this vital region's future? As Washington races to reclaim lost influence, the real question is, can the U.S. still shape events in the Sahel, or has the region already chosen a different path?